Okay. So we're here to um, talk about this podcast that we both just listened to and share that with the internet. And so I figured, given that we're heading into sharing it, and some people will have not uh, actually listened to this thing, which it will be linked in the description thingy. Um, uh, I figured, given that, we should start with a summary, and I'm going to say, Michael, you do the summary because you've listened to the podcast twice and also just a few minutes ago.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yeah.
for the listening audience, it is called A Scaling Selfhood, Collective Intelligence from Cells to Economies with Michael Levin on the Musing Mind podcast. Yeah, gosh, I was not mentally prepared for a summary, but I can definitely try to put it together. I was hoping like journal or something for a while, but I finished it like just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so there's what Michael Levin was bringing in that really captured my attention is the way that evolution already has a lot of examples of what it means to scale intelligence. And that in the process of doing that, you can see some evolutionary arcs that explain something like, what does it mean to be a being on the inside? What is a self inside each of these stages? Not that there are rigid stages, but the this process of, like, I love the way that he described there being something that if you're going to try to define intelligence in a way that makes coherent sense across all these scales, you have physics being an expression of a type of intelligence. But the place where your biology starts doing some really interesting things is that it's actually explicitly working on building up from components of agency, where your building blocks, instead of being blocks like rocks, are agents that have intentions. They have goals and are optimizing for those goals with some kind of effort, with some kind of a capacity. Some kind of a control system. And then looking at the process by which you go from like a cell to a multicellular stuff to an organ up to an organism. And then that whole process seems like it has analogs that go up to the social scale and possibly quite a bit larger. And some of the things that he was describing about the structure of the whole thing suggest the possibility that we may be embedded in an already extant larger intelligence system, and that there's some interesting questions about orienting to that. But there was a ton that he went into there. It was 2 hours.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So
Well, and it was,
that's my off the top of a summary.
Yeah, cool. And we'll bring in other pieces as we're talking about it. What I found neat too is that, like, unlike so you and I have been talking for a number of years about this kind of thing, collective intelligence and so forth, and we've been using analogies from cells and how they relate to the the organisms that they constitute and so forth. But, like, I don't know about you, but I don't know shit about cells, right? Like, I don't actually, we're like reasoning by analogy here, but like pretty vaguely, right? It's just sort of like, well, it must be, like, as a little perspective, to be like a heart cell inside a heart, you've got there must be some sort of sense you have of what's going on outside, I guess, right? But, like, we don't know anything about that.
Chemicals.
He's actually done the
chemicals.
Whereas he's actually done a bunch of the research with the chemistry and biology and so forth of it, like those levels of abstraction of the question. We're reasoning much more just sort of abstractly. So it's cool to get some of those details plugged in, to hear about gap junctions and various other ways that the cells go about having a bit of shared selfhood, even.
I found like he was talking about the shared selfhood and the trade-off between individuality and that shared selfhood to be very nuanced and grounded at the same time in a way that I really liked. I thought it was one of the clearer explorations of the question rather than asserting an answer. It was highlighting the question space It's like the kinds of things I've
Mm-hmm.
been thinking about. Like I think we've both been thinking about a
Yeah.
great deal. That it's been very central, definitely for my attention, is as we work on encouraging the development of a large scale society, possibly species wide type of collective intelligence that we would want to participate in. What is my sense of me in that?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that relate to the emergence itself? These are questions that I can see are very central to what it means for me to participate in that. But I don't have what feels like a solid answer yet. And it feels like he was describing the question in a lot more detail than I've usually
Yeah.
heard elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's dive into that because I think that's we might get to a lot of cool stuff here, but that was a situation where you came out of the podcast with a bit of, or like out of listening to the podcast, first a week ago, feeling again concerned about something you'd expressed concern about before, and I came out of it going, oh no, I'm actually not. I figured out why this isn't a
Yeah.
concern. So this feels like the obvious place to start, in terms of yeah, what there is for us to talk about. So, can you lay out what your concern is? Both, so
Yeah.
I have it in freshly and so that listeners have it.
Yeah. Uh, it sounds like something I arguably inherited from Dad. Just like variations of, if God is so loving, then why are things shitty?
Mm-hmm.
um, so again, it feels like it's one of the many angles on the problem of evil. But the thing in this case is, even if you're looking at constructing an intelligence that doesn't yet exist, um, like if you're already embedded in an intelligence that is vastly greater than you, then it's sort of like you're along for the ride, and it doesn't matter what your opinion is.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's unless your opinion already matters, in which case it's not a question, right? So it's like also
Yeah.
irrelevant. So
Yeah.
if you're looking at, okay, so we're going to participate in the construction and co-creation and evolution of some sort of shared intelligence, some sort of collective intelligence, then what that thing can grow into, first off, almost definitely is going to have a scope that goes beyond, like what Michael Levin was referring to as the cognitive horizon. His cognitive horizon is going to be vastly outside of what any individual human is able to track. And so as it's tracking those goals, like the analogy that you pegged this to, I thought was a great analogy for zooming in on this, was the thing of, well, if we're like skin cells on some sort of larger organism, or we become like that, I don't like I was just biking here, and well, actually a better example is I was eating pizza right before I was biking here, and I managed to burn the roof of my mouth, which often happens when I eat pizza. It doesn't matter how slowly I eat it, I somehow manage to burn the roof of my mouth, and I end up with a little bit of skin that comes off. And I in some sense, I just massacred a whole bunch of living organisms in order for me to enjoy a piece of pizza. And so, and there's something of like, I would prefer not to do that, but also I'm not too worried about it. And I don't think this is an error on my part. So it's not obvious to me that whatever kind of collective intelligence that we would create wouldn't be exactly like that, such that, yeah, sure, we have our own local goals, but also at some point just North America gets wiped out because it was more interested in watching Beetlejuice sparkle or something. Like there's
Yeah. So my take on this, which I think was sort of in the background of my intuitions when I said to you last week that I wasn't worried, but it sort of like came into new vividness and like pulled in a few other pieces, as I was listening to the podcast where they have this rock climbing and skin cell example, scraping things off. The thing I noticed was that, well, I if I were to, I have a couple of critiques of the conversation that they had, and one of them was that they were reasoning by analogy without taking stock of the ways in which the analogy breaks down, and so it's like, okay, would it be just like that? How could we know? And they kind of throw their hands up and they're like, we just can't know. Like, well, wait, what can we know though? One thing we know that is different about skin cells versus us Well, there's a few things that are different. One, we can have a conversation about it, like an actual abstract conversation about it. Um, a skin cell is not capable of expressing, is not capable of worrying about such a thing, as far as we know. But more importantly, to my actual argument here is that we have the power to vote with our feet. And so if I have a choice between two collective intelligences I could participate in, and in one of those, my needs are what I care about is really deeply is really deeply invited into the sort of collective intelligence and cared for. And if in another one, the collective intelligence doesn't give a shit, I am going to vote. I'm going to choose to participate in the first one, which means that there's an evolutionary pressure on collective intelligences to be able to effectively care for their constituents' needs. There's an alternative pressure, which is to be able to gaslight them into not knowing what their needs are. And I think we've reinvented the Gen 2, Gen 3 distinction, like the two attractors of coercive culture and collaborative culture. Like we've sort of rederived those two attractors via those two evolutionary pressures. And so insofar as, I'm curious what your response is to that. I have a few more pieces, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's a related piece that that I feel like I had an insight that Michael Levin didn't seem to, and I mentioned it to you by text. It seems relevant at this juncture of the conversation.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hide my picture because I keep looking at it. There we go. So this will be a little bit of a tangent, but I think it relates importantly. I think there already is a social scale version of gap junctures, or gap junctions.
Oh,
and the way that it works, I mean, surprisingly, it's via memetics, because like that's the thing I talk about. But what I'm looking at is how. So the gap juncture, literally for cells. I spent a little time reading up on this, and I don't claim to be an expert, but it's like when you have two cells that are either stuck next to each other, like skin cells often are, or they kind of float next to each other and they bump into each other. They have a way of hooking up their gap junctures to kind of plug into each other in order to do the transmission from internal to internal. Okay. But the thing is that the reason that it has to be mechanical physical contact is because that is the interface between cells.
They can't like call each other on the phone.
Right. The primary interface between human beings' interiors is not like physical contact.
Yeah.
It's actually through communication structures. And so what you find is that memetics defines the domain at which you want to look for something analogous to a gap junction. And what I think we do have that. It just in the sort of the Gen 2 flavor of doing things, the way it does it is by having everybody operate in a simplified format so that their interior is directly inject-to-able.
Oh, right. So now I can get you stressed out about the latest, talking point of my political, party by just like blasting you with the latest meme about who like how we've always been at war with Eurasia.
Right. So the memetic identification structure has that nature to it. So I highlight that as an example there, because it seems to me that when we're dealing with large-scale intelligences, for one thing, we already are.
Yes. Yeah.
And it seems like, I had a more coherent point in my mind a moment ago, or at least I thought I did. Maybe I discovered the incoherence in the course of talking about it. But there's okay. I think I'm seeing it. There's a spot where I think I don't have a certainty. I have more like a question here that sort of hovers in a space. It feels related to this business of maybe everybody is already doing what they want.
Mhm.
There's a quality here of I guess maybe the short version of it would be to say, why should Gen 3 win? I can see mathematically why it should, but I observe the fact that it hasn't. It seems like we have instances, but it still hasn't. And it's like, well, by definition, that means it isn't the thing. But it's like, like there's a little bit of Mott and Bailey going on here, where I'm looking at something like, okay, if we want to define, like maybe we need yet another term for the things that are this care for your constituents' goals style of evolutionary convergence,
Mhm.
the rational means type thing
Mhm.
that Deutsch talks about. So that's one definition. And if we're going to focus on that definitional cluster, it seems to me like there's a very natural question, which is why should that structure necessarily win out over the one that is able to coordinate via dumbing its constituents down into interfaceable machine parts?
Yeah. So, uh, yeah, I mean, we can't know for sure, right? There are a lot of factors. At any phase that has thus far been discussed, there's a sense in which, like, the dumbing down approach, can win by violence, and perhaps has at times. Uh, the I mean, I think there's some clue there in terms of, in terms of dumbing down, right? Like, required to make the coercive system work is um, lack of agency or capacity or creativity, in a certain sense, on the part of the subagents. Um,
Yeah. Actually, this ties to the thing of like there's actually an advantage to building a tower out of cats instead of bricks.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So there's right. If you can do it, right, and that's
Right.
the thing. It's in a sense harder, but it's way more resilient. Something like that, maybe,
Yeah.
um, or may and way more adaptable is why it's more resilient. Um, yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like the things that you actually uh like in I'm reminded of it seems sort of like incentive gradients become the most interesting feature of your reality once you're talking about um, building things out of agents. Uh, and I'm not quite sure what the analog is for non-agentic building, but like something like least action principle or something like that. I'm not quite sure what it is, but
Right, and
it's a different factor of question that seems like it can actually reflect on itself after a level. Like we can talk about incentive landscapes.
yeah, one of the things that struck me while I was um, listening to this was, I had the sense that um, something was getting confused around, uh, to what does evolution refer, um, and and pretty early on in listening to it, I had this sense that that Michael Levin was referring to evolution as, um, uh, was using evolution as shorthand for biological evolution. Um, and I wasn't sure if that was exactly true, because he was talking about agents and sort of where they come from. Do they come from evolution or do they come from um, design? And there's an important sense in which evolution and design are different. Part of how you could characterize, maybe we need to talk about first order evolution and second order evolution, because there's a sense in which everything is evolution. Cognition is evolutionary in nature. Like, the
Yeah.
way that the way that reorganization happens in the brain, according to PCT or predictive coding or whatever, is evolutionary. And so you can't talk about um, design as other than evolution. But design is a new kind of evolution that has telos, whereas biological evolution doesn't have telos. It just has, like, do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean. I'm under the impression that um, I strongly agree with you. While I was listening to it, it didn't even occur to me because I was assuming that he meant extended evolution. And there were a couple of places where I sort of went, when he was saying, you know, like evolution isn't the only way that you come up with an intelligence. And I was sort of squinting at it, trying to think, what the fuck other mechanism are you imagining? Can you give me any examples? Any? And but in that sense, I'm also viewing things like the creation of stars as an evolutionary process, given the
Yes, yeah,
constraints
exactly.
of physics.
And Carl Friston has a bunch of great stuff on that.
I don't know who Carl Friston is.
He's the guy who came up with the predictive processing thing. And there's a great interview with him by Reese Lindmark, where he talks about stars as having evolved and planets and orbits, and then goes all the way up to, you know, the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Um,
The Catholic Church, the end of evolution. But when it comes to evolution versus design, it seems to me that the relevant juncture there is the first person. Like there's this impression, like I can imagine doing it, or I could imagine, like it feels different to be on the inside of a process that is the result of evolution than it is to witness the process of evolution from the outside. When I switch it to the inside, I start wanting to talk about design and choice and will and etc.
Yeah.
Which suggests something interesting, like from the perspective of super intelligences, which I'm not sure how you want to count steps, but like 1 or 3 steps above us. They may actually have something akin to design that we can't even begin to do, but is actually design, is actual free will as far as it's concerned, etc.
Whoa. Okay. I think I kind of see what you mean. Yeah. Here's a neat way of putting it. Something like, it's like you could imagine a being that has a level of control over what to us, like, we could only relate to as synchronicity and serendipity. And we can kind of go, whoa, look at that, it all synchronized. Like, I definitely must have, you know, done good, you know, manifestation, I guess. Right? Like, you can kind of be like, things turned out in my favor in the way that I sort of intended, but I definitely wasn't, you know, but you can imagine a being that sort of has the something to sort of manifest that more directly.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to manifest myself a drink of water.
Yeah.
This is actually isotonic drink, so I may be failing at water, but anyway. Yeah. So here's another piece of the whole puzzle that that I was seeing when it comes to the difference between how your cells relate to you and how you relate to a larger collective intelligences. So David Deutsch has this concept of a universal explainer, which I think is quite striking, and it suggests that there might be something a little bit confused actually about dimensions of the cognitive horizon thing that that Michael Levin was talking about, which is an important concept. And I actually thought, I think he went and called it a light cone, but it seems different than a light cone. I almost wanted to call it a might cone. Sort of like, what's the range of what I might do and what I have the might to do. Anyway, so yeah, so David Deutsch has this concept of universal explainer, and basically he's making the case that something completely qualitative happened with the shift to humans. This is pretty this is not a hard point to argue on that level of abstraction. But the point being that we are
I
In
think
terms
I
of
see.
in terms of cognitive horizon, um, there's a sense in which so like there's an anecdote which may be apocryphal of the president visiting the NASA headquarters, and he greets a janitor and says, what, or something like that, and says, what do you here? What do you do here? And the janitor, sweeping the floor, says, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And it's like humans, so like an analogy that they fail to use at any point here is the collective intelligence that is a company. Like these already exist,
Yeah.
and in general, everybody in the company can, at some level of abstraction, understand what the company's mission is. And is that because we have so like you could argue maybe that that's because we've failed to build sufficiently interesting companies that are doing something so complex that nobody in the org can understand them?
So I've actually thought about this quite
Okay.
a fair bit, and I think so. This is the same place that I think the rationalists go when they're like every now and then I'll bump into them talking about how there's nothing interesting about the incomputable spaces because those are just like maybe they don't even exist, or if they do exist they don't matter because everything that is actually relevant in the universe turns out universe is computable, blah blah blah. And I feel like these are variations on the same error, which is
Hmm.
forgetting that you're a human looking at the question. So there is a real thing where um, I, that human beings do have some flexibility about what horizon they can choose to pay attention to at a given time. There's something like their functional horizon and their actual horizontal capacity. We don't know what the absolute capacity is for a human. Also, we would literally be incapable of understanding what to compare it to, but
Upwards.
upwards, yes. Um, but in which case it makes the measurement interesting because we'd have the impression that it's infinite. And then there are things probably beyond that infinity that we can never know about. Just like, anyway, whatever that space is doing. But you can track this in terms of the experience of somebody inside of a company. Like somebody inside of a company is spending most of their time operating in terms of how do I take care of the details of my job, and I need to make sure that these people are getting me the answers for this email so we can take care of this system over here. Like I think of my sister who runs a whole bunch of administrative stuff for a hospital system.
Yeah.
And there's like the expanse of horizon of care there is pretty significant. But I'm pretty sure that a given person like my sister is, I think, a really good example, at least for me. But I think you know this type of person, like somebody who's acting as the administrative spider at the center of everything and is sort of coordinating all of the bits. But I think even my sister has very little idea about the details of exactly how the financial system works, doesn't know what the family lives are like for the CEO folk.
I think we're confusing two things here. So like I have limited cognitive capacity, and and so I can't pay attention to all of the details on all of the levels of abstraction. But that's different from I could in principle care about any of those details.
But but the company already does.
Oh, right. I see what you mean. Like the whole right, but the thing is, like, I can talk about all of those details. Do you see what, like,
I see what you're saying, but this is equivalent to highlighting that any skin cell could be any other skin cell. So there isn't really anything emergent from having skin.
And like a cell can't talk about, as far as I know, I'm making an assumption here about the cognitive capacity of a cell, but I have reason to think it's pretty good. A cell, it cannot wonder, geez, I wonder if Malcolm is like, experiencing an adequate internet connection on his call today.
Yeah.
Like that's not a type of question it can ask. Whereas like a human can ask a question about any of those details on any scale, and then there's just a question of how much intelligence do you have to say anything useful about it.
Yeah, I think this is circular. I really do, because it's so. Here's the thing is, it's tautological, because you're speaking from inside being a human, right? Because what you're saying is, I can see everything a human being can see, and when you embed a human system in this system that I can see, a human being in that system can see that potentially. I'm left with, okay, so here's the thing. A company is going to do much the same kind of thing that a multicellular blob is, in the sense that the multicellular blob is more spread out through space and time and is actually tracking more than any person in practice can. And I know in principle any person could act as any of the nodes there, but there is an important factor here, which means that there are things that the company can start to track and care about and respond to that might be beyond the capacity of any person to track. And if that were true, no person in the system would be aware of them. There would just be weird things, like somehow there's this weird social vibe shift that's happening.
Oh, okay, hang on a second. I see what you're saying, I think. Yeah, and that's different. That's different from the thing I seemed to be pointing against. So I see why you're pushing back. I guess part of what I'm claiming is that is that it is pretty significant that we can have this conversation.
I agree. I think that it is very significant that we can have this conversation. I also think that it feels more universal than it is, for the same reason that when we made the shift to, whatever we are in this case, made the shift from multicellular blobs to organs.
What I hear there in that "we," which I just want to highlight, is an identification with the entire lineage of biological evolution, which is actually really beautiful, right? Like there's actually, it's like, yeah, when my family even, moved out of Scotland and came to North America, when we did that, it was hard, for the original settlers, right? Like, it's like,
well, I think there's something very real of this. This is a tangent, but I think it's a related tangent, and it's an important one. It's actually related to spreading out through time. It's part of the whole spreading out through time and space.
Yeah. No. I'm with you. That's good.
The same way that my belly button is my old mouth. Right? And my old butthole, but there's something to be said about my mother's body is my old body. There's something funny about that, in the sense of, Dad's testes had some of my code, right? And there's like some nuance about
right. But in terms of where I was like well, I mean, yeah, in some sense, there's like, some small amount. Blah, details. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But if I actually am tracking, when did I start? It's actually it's very weird to insist on defining that as the moment when the sperm and the egg came together, because there's a whole causal chain that brought that sperm and that egg together, and a process by which those are created. So there's a very meaningful sense in which I have been coming into existence for at least 13.8 billion years. So yeah.
Right. You were just a bit harder to point at like a few centuries ago.
Yes, a lot harder to point at a few centuries ago. And I'm going to be even harder to point at in a few centuries.
Yeah. Well, you'll be easier to point at in a few centuries from now than you were back then, probably. Assuming we still have historical records of stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway, so that was a fun tangent, and I forget what it
you
was a tangent off of.
well, you were saying when we made the
blobs,
jump.
blobs. Yes. Okay. Right. So, well, the blobs is the handle. So there's a shift from multicellular blobs to organs.
Right, the specialization shift.
Yes, and in that specialization shift, now it is difficult to talk about this in a coherent way to highlight what seems to me like the obvious analog, because we're using our current capacities to draw the analogies to talk about it. And so we're looking down at the process. But what I'm highlighting is it is like something on the inside to be that process. And if you're on the inside of that process, if you're part of a multicellular blob that's coming together into like the specialization thing, I think it's going to feel roughly equivalent to what we're experiencing now in our ability to talk about these higher levels emerging. There's a glitch in that what it means to orient to earlier levels, like there are fewer levels to go below to, and what it means to orient from our perspective way up here is quite a bit different. But there's this immensely anthropocentric way of orienting to this entire evolutionary process that's sort of acting as though humans are the magic pivot point. How do you know that? Because we're humans. Like that's the argument. We're experiencing from the inside as humans, and therefore this stage is important.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
I don't get the feeling that that is the feeling essence of what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that is a necessary, that is the necessary core behind the argument. Like what I'm hearing you talk about is pointing towards the thing about like the universal explainers thing, the thing of there is something pretty significant about the fact that if you cut, like if you sufficiently retard a human being, they can no longer reason about these advanced levels. They can't, like you look at somebody with Down syndrome and they may have a lot of difficulty orienting to being part of an organization. They might not be able to understand the organization except as some kind of like a god or something.
Is that a specific? I don't know much about Down syndrome. Is that a specific thing that people with Down syndrome have trouble with?
I honestly don't know. I may be being incredibly insulting and un-PC. I don't know, but there's certainly a level of brain damage for which this is going to be true.
Yeah.
And
this wasn't sure how
specific
what you were saying was.
Yeah, don't take it as overly specific. I'm just highlighting, it seems obvious to me that you can have a linguistic social entity that is incapable of understanding these higher orders of organization, and you would still want to call that thing a human. And yeah, there's something interesting that seems to be happening in that there's this expansion of our capacity to reason and talk about these levels above us, that we can have this conversation. That it's unclear what it even would mean for a cell to orient or fail to orient to the larger multicellular infrastructure that it would be embedded in. Although I do think there's an interesting exception, which is a cell that doesn't, cancer. I think cancer is a very clear example of this phenomenon. Also a cell that ends up getting a mutation that causes it not to develop any gap junctures. Like I think that would be an interesting example. Right. So you actually do have cases where it actually means something to refuse to interface with the larger structure, even when you're talking at the cellular level. But like even sort of glossing over that, what I'm hearing in your thing is that there's something interesting and important and about the ability to talk about all these higher levels and that we can reason about them. And I completely agree. I think that's defining this stage that we find ourselves identifying with. The place where I'm striking is. Do you want me to continue?
No, yeah, finish your thing.
Okay. The place where I am striking is in the claim that it's universal. I think the universality is from an anthropocentric point of view. It is saying everything that humans can reason about, humans can reason about. That's the
Okay,
circularity I'm calling out on and saying, I don't think it's actually that different.
great. So my my take then is that we need to differentiate some things, and I don't know what the things are, but um, it seems to me that something became universal at the point of humans, and maybe something else did not. And then we can start just talking about what those somethings are, and it might be that there's several somethings in each category. Um, but it's like you go from a uh, some sort of pre-human primate whose capacity to explain things about the world and sort of understand what's going on is qualitatively it's definitely more sophisticated in a sense than a little monkey that a little tiny monkey as opposed to a great ape. It's more sophisticated than a rat, but it's still not like asking any deep questions and like devising ways to answer them, for instance. And then you get human, and somewhere in the Homo genus, I guess, I don't know exactly when this occurred, but somewhere there you now have a species whose basic way of relating to the world seems to go it seems to have gone from kind of shallow to extremely deep. Like we're like, all right, we got to figure out all of the particles that everything's made of. We've got to figure out all of the entirety of all the way out to space, and we can talk about light cones now. And like we have gone already infinitely far in a bunch of directions, in the sense that we can conceive of infinities in the first place, um, and and so like there may be things beyond our conception in various sorts of ways, but there's also like something has gone universal, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Like even to the point where if we were talking to, like, suppose that we met an alien who um who was the mouthpiece of a 400 trillion or like the alien was our size but was in an extremely coherent superorganism flow with 400 billion other aliens. Like that alien would be able to talk, could supposedly like sort of talk with us, and if we were like, so what's the deal with this thing that you guys do, the alien would be able to make some sort of analogy, say, look, it's going to be hard for you guys to explain, but it's kind of like this, and we could accept kind of like this, and we could sort of go, okay, I don't really understand, in the same way I don't really understand gap junctures, right? But like I can kind of understand by analogy anything on any level of abstraction.
It still strikes me as circular there. Like there's a spot there that I'm like, you give me pause on one spot uh where I'm left staring at it going, well, this is interesting. I wonder what, like, I don't know here. I have a suspicion that it's actually not as um as something like not as interesting as it looks at first glance. And let me become less abstract. So if you imagine, so I'm going to do this in two steps here. So first, let's look at your superorganism alien thing. Suppose that superorganism alien thing were like a human talking to, I wanted to say an ant, but an ant is a terrible example because they have this weird superorganism thing going. But I don't know, maybe like a
Cockroach.
cat.
Okay, a cat.
Yeah, a cockroach might be more interesting, but like I think with a cat, the intuitions will transfer a little bit better.
Sure, yeah.
Like there are these ways where like like when trying to keep our cats from going outside, we have strictly indoor cats for
Mhm.
safety and health reasons. Um, like if the cat were physically determined to get outside, there are lots of ways that it could like trick us and just outspeed us and try to zip out, and we'd have to do some kind of clever thing with contraptions and so on. But it turns out, um, like there are a couple of psychological tricks that you can do with the cat that actually just flummox it. Like if you put your foot in front of the door in a particular kind of motion, the cat will sort of back off and reassess, and you can watch the thinking process of the cat reassessing while you close the door. Another is cats don't seem to be capable of understanding coordination between humans. So we can say, would you pet the cat while I walk out the door?
Right.
They seem to be incapable of figuring this trick out. So but that said, that doesn't mean that like when the cat comes up and says, is it food time? Like we can't communicate in the cat's terms whether or not it is the cat's food time.
Well, you
It
can
strikes
communicate a
me,
yes, a yes or a no, but not a when.
yeah, but you could also communicate things like I'm listening to you, and or I'm ignoring you, or I
Mhm.
like you, and
Mhm.
it's gonna, and yes, I know I'm defying your will right now. Like you can have something that's almost like a
Mhm.
conversation with the cat. Um, but the thing is that what we do as humans, if we're syncing up with the cat and having this conversation, which a lot of people don't bother with cats, so I think it's maybe a funny
No, no,
example to use, but I think it's
I
really
think it's good
important.
though.
What we do in effect is we sync up with the uniqueness of the cat. So there's a bit of a shift, but we also dumb down tremendously,
Mhm.
enormously. And then in that dumbing down, like the cat can have the experience of, yes, I'm communicating with these other cats. And there's there's something about the alien thing that to me, like the circularity is built into the example, where if you pull out the circularity, I think what you're left with is uh, the aliens might sync up with our really tiny compared to theirs, at least across some axes, cognitive horizon,
Mhm.
and communicate to us in those terms,
Mhm.
which we on the inside can interpret as, okay, there are other dimensions that I can hear we can't even understand. So we'll just put an X there as our variable. And meanwhile, the aliens are kind of looking at us the same way that we look at these cats who are flummoxed by us putting our foot down in a funny way while closing the door. Sort of like, yeah, you
Yeah,
can do
no,
that,
no, no.
but
There is a qualitative difference between being able to talk with the alien about how you have a cognitive horizon. That to me feels extremely significant. Like we could have a conversation about with the alien. Like you can't have that conversation with your cat.
I understand you can't have that conversation with the cat because, but the equivalent with the cat is the conversation about food, right? It's like
I don't think those are equivalent. I think there's a qualitative difference. I feel like I'm
I
arguing something
agree.
extremely boring here. Like I'm like,
So I agree that there is a qualitative difference, but I feel like you're
okay,
only porting some of the analogy over rather than pumping the whole thing through the analogy.
I think we need to operationalize this a little bit. Like, why does it matter? What would we expect to be different about the world as a result of this? I don't know. Like, um, I'm trying to
I,
understand what type of disagreement we even seem to be having here. Like, is it John Nurse has this thing of like the signal and the corrective, where you're saying literally the same thing, but one of you saying like, yeah, it's all black except for the half that's white, and the other going, no, it's all white except for the half that's black. Um, this is one way to describe a zebra. Um, you know, white with black stripes, black with white stripes. Anyway,
yeah.
like we may be having that kind of disagreement here, where we're sort of saying the same thing, but there's like a figure ground inversion. It may be that there's an important reason to have the figure and ground be one way or the other, um, and that may be what we're arguing about. Like, I don't feel like I disagree with you about what is so, but there's something about how I seem to want to frame it that feels
Yeah.
like important to me.
I have so I can see the thing that I think you're leading towards that I'm disagreeing with, so I can just name
Oh,
that thing, and I think
yeah, let's try
this
that.
highlights something about what the capacity
I,
is.
I may.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll find out where I stand on that.
So I think you are gesturing towards there being a kind of universality in an individual human's capacity to orient to all of the levels above.
Uh, yeah, I am saying
Yeah,
something about that.
yeah. Oh, you were saying something about it. Okay. Okay. The specific thing that I'm 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 getting from you is something like that. Um, it is like something like that. It is not possible for there to be something that a super intelligence cares about that we are incapable of orienting to as individuals.
Whoa. Okay. Orienting to does a lot of work there. Um, uh, we can absolutely be incapable of meaningfully, usefully orienting to it. I am with you on that front. Like, if that's what you mean by orienting to, no disagreement. Um, However, my claim is that we can orient to the existence of a thing that we can't usefully orient to. We can wonder what it would be like to be a creature that can usefully orient to that. We can strategize with each other. Hey, do you suppose if the two of us got together, we might be wrong, but like we could attempt to apprehend that and fail. And we could have consciousness about the fact that there is a thing we are not usefully capable of apprehending that we are attempting to apprehend.
Okay, I mean that seems obvious because we're having this conversation.
Exactly. That's why I felt so confused, because you seem to be arguing with it.
No, we can't be having this conversation.
I was very confused.
Yeah, no,
and that this matters, I guess, is the other half. Like that this makes some sort of important qualitative difference that I don't yet know how to name, but that it makes a qualitative difference that reasoning by analogy from down to up doesn't get you because of the difference between cats and us. And that there's an important like needing to acknowledge that difference as part of doing any reasoning by analogy. And that's what I kept hearing during the podcast seemed to be missing, was like recognizing that like, no, you can't simply just say, oh yeah, it'll be like the cells, but but upwards. Like, no, it will definitely be different.
Yeah, it seems to me like it necessarily does have to be different. I think there's something of I'm wanting to inject something sort of like it's a kind of humility. It's something like I think we are in fact going through analogous steps.
I agree. Yeah.
It's just that the thing that you're pointing at, which is about like our reason to our capacity to reason about all these advanced things, and to be able to talk about these things that we can't orient to. This is what it feels like at this stage
Yep.
of the organizational scheme. And that is like there are jumps like that when you go from cell to multicellular blob to organ systems. Like each of these jumps has a thing that I think if it could talk, would talk in a similar way.
Big if, man. That is a big if. I really think that if is illegal. You're committing a major counterfactual here.
I really am trying to point at something that I'm running into the problem of I think the interiors above us are as larger than us as we are larger than the thing going on with cats.
I could I think that is true along some dimensions and not others, and that's where I said we need to break down and talk about what is universal and what is not. Um, yeah, that's my response. Like, you know, I have been sloppily at times equivocating between collective intelligence, collective wisdom, and collective consciousness. To name just three things, there's also collective agency, right? And it might be that there's a sense in which, and maybe these are the wrong dimensions or whatever, I don't know, but just to take a few, for example, it may be that there's a sense in which some type of cognition has in fact, or some type of something um, has become sort of universal at the level of humans, and you can get better of it, but it doesn't bigger or something, or I don't know what the dimensionality is like, but it something has become universal at the stage of humans, um, and then there's something else that hasn't. But both of these seem pretty obviously true to me. I'm curious how it seems to you.
Um, I I I am highly suspicious of, like, I mean, how would you know that? Like the way that you would experience the universality would be like it being universal versus it just seeming universal. As you witness the stages scaling up, how would you tell the difference between it seems universal because as a human you're not capable of even conceiving of something that is beyond that? Like Turing computability, I think, is a fantastic example of this. It, like, a bunch of people get fixated on this business of um, the incomputable stuff is incomputable. You think this is beyond any kind of plausible reasoning process of anything that's even faintly like an algorithm as far as we can tell.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going, okay, that's great, but that's still human centric. There may be things that are able to reason in what we would call incomputable. And they might even be doing it by something that is sort of an extension of the very intuitions that we use for algorithms, but they're extensions in a direction that we don't relate to. What it would look like to us when it comes back and talks to us is back in computable language. So you would get things that seem random, you get weird oracle effects, you would get strange things where you can show the computation was correct, but you'd have no idea how it happened. That would be the only feedback you would get, that what you thought was universal was actually just a description of your cognitive horizon with respect, but in a way that is analogous to.
Hang on, no, hang on. That's different from cognitive horizon. That is a type of cognition. I'm not saying we are universal cognitioners. I'm not saying we can do all types of cognition.
I am, okay, clarify.
Like,
I actually thought you were making a claim something like that, so that's why.
Right. Okay. Cool. Well, we found something like a crux. Universal cognition. So, I mean, trivially speaking, like, okay, okay, I don't think you're gonna like this analogy, which is to say, I think you're gonna say it's irrelevant and you're gonna shoot it down. But it does seem like it points at something relevant. Like, you could imagine an organ that a brain has that has a quantum computer in it that can factor primes in whatever, polynomial time, whatever, right? or do prime factorization in polynomial times. Factoring primes is easy, 1 and the number. You can imagine a being having an organ like that functionally, such that like you give it some multiple of some primes, and it's like, yeah, that's 2 times 3 times like
right.
whatever other primes. And like I not having such an organ would be able to verify the answer, but not compute it myself. But that's
Right.
still a but like there's nothing that prevents me from apprehending the question.
Right.
I am functionally limited in my approaches to answering it. I'm also functionally limited by my working memory. I'm functionally limited by whether I have a pen and paper at hand. I'm functionally like there's just like a bunch of pragmatic limitations to my compute, if you want to call it that. There's limitations to my capabilities, but I can sort of still behold the question. Now, the thing that I will say is there might be questions that are in some sense require more working memory than I have to even consider the question. And some of those can still be in some sense beheld by a human by having written down all of the different parts of the question. Like by augmenting my working memory with a piece of paper, I can now behold a question that I couldn't behold without the technology of a piece of paper. I wish I had a good example here. There probably is one. I mean, even well, I mean, to be
almost all mathematics is like
right.
this.
Actually,
you
yeah.
learn how to expand your question set, and it's
yeah,
you're learning how to compress it
yeah.
within your working memory.
In fact, like the question of like what are the prime factors of 20 digits worth of number, I can't hold that 20 digits of number in my working memory. So even to behold that requires writing it down, right? And so I guess there's a way in which I guess I would just say some of the things that happen when you go up seem to me like that. They are of that type. And I imagine that seems true to you as well. And maybe what you're saying is we can't know if there aren't also some other type. And I'm like, I guess that's true, but it seems to me that an awfully big number fall into this first type. And yeah, I don't know. I keep having an intuition that in some sense, like we can only ever be bad at things. We can't ever be like, I think David Deutsch makes an argument for this, but I forget what the argument is. It's like, it's some sort of like I think he presents a case like a case for how the line of reasoning that you might be doing, but it might also be an adjacent line of reasoning, basically produces a paradox where you come up with it's sort of like it produces a kind of like separate magisteria, a kind of cognitive dark matter, a kind of like something is somehow in your universe and yet you can't even begin to approach explaining it. And that just seems sort of paradoxical. Like you could, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, the category of thing, I don't know even if to call it a thing.
Probably not, but
the direction that I've been pondering that feels so significant to me is the possibility that so it wouldn't be things that we know are there but we can't ponder. It would be things that we wouldn't even be able to orient to knowing that they are there, because that's what it would feel like on the inside for there to be things that are beyond our capacity to orient to basically at all.
right. But I guess what I'm saying is at the point when there's an alien or a collective superintelligence that does know that the thing is there, it could be like, so like, I mean, I don't know.
We
If
can
I
say there's a
imagine,
thing there, and we can say,
right,
great, there is a thing there. We can
right,
write an X for it. Yeah.
I think that's meaningful.
Yeah.
Like,
I
like,
thought we agreed on
and
that about half an hour ago.
um, okay, so I wanna try a bit of an experiment here, which is I've been I've been talking a big game about how um, much more interesting than having an argument between your two eyes is like finding the depth perception of them. And you seem like an obvious person with whom to do some experimenting with around like what does that look like? What does it feel like to orient, like to shift one's orientation in that way? And you and I have so far been having a good natured argument as I assess it. We've been sort of very much, you know, bringing these two perspectives to bear, but um, but in a relatively argumentative kind of um, frame. And yeah, so I'd like to invite us without, I mean, the extent to which this is my invitation is going to end in a moment, and then we'll both just be participants in it if you accept. Basically, to invite us to explore together what it would be like for us each to be eyes, and we're trying to like see the depthy view here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been toying with something kind of like that in the background, going, this is weirdly argumentative. There's something kind of fun about it.
Yeah.
How to do better. Whatever. I guess we'll just see where this goes. I know we care about each other. I'm not worried about it.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so it's not that the argumenting is somehow wrong. It's just like maybe we can do better.
Yeah.
Um.
Yeah, I like that. That in abstract.
Oh, actually, that
I don't know what that looks like.
Okay, so well, the first thing it brings to mind for me is an interesting analogy, which is,
oh dear.
um,
we exile all of our analogies.
Well, it's a type of analogy that I don't think we've been doing much yet, which is rather than like trying to go up or down, it's just sort of like at the level of stuff, which is like I've sometimes experienced like being with people, and we have some sort of like shared perception about something. Say we have like some sort of project-ish type thing that we're doing. We like think up about it, and we're like, yeah, we got this thing that we're seeing together about what makes sense. So you're gonna go off and do that, and Malcolm's gonna go off and do this. Like, great. And then like we like break. Now I'm off on my own, and I'm like, I no longer really see the sense that made.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, let's go to our quarters. This is stupid.
Right. And I've done a bit of theorizing about this. I've got a model that there's like there's a few different ways that reasons that this can happen. Some of them are quite boring, which is literally like you just actually needed to ask a few questions of some of the other people in the group. You just actually don't have enough information to start, it turns out, and you didn't realize until you like zoomed in on your section. But then because you sort of think, okay, now I'm on my own, I'm going to do the thing, you sort of forget that you can actually go ask those questions. And so you're just left with a puzzle that is missing some pieces that are just literally in the other room. Like that's like one very sort of boring way that this happens. And if you notice that, very easy to solve. You just go, I seem to be stuck on this. What questions do I have? Oh, I've got this question and that question. I'll go ask Bob and Jack about the things. Okay, great. But then there's another way that like the thing can go, which is actually that the sort of apparent collective intelligence of the group was actually exerting a downward pressure on you that caused something to make sense to you that sort of wouldn't if the group had all of the information that you were sitting with, but you were repressing it in order to sort of allow the group to flow. And so you were like, yeah, that makes sense. And like some other parts of you are like, fuck this shit. This doesn't make any sense at all. And then in that case, sometimes you go off on your own and you do it anyway, continuing to repress those parts on behalf of the group. But in other cases, you go off on your own to do it, and those parts are suddenly like, this was a dumb idea the whole time. I don't know why we said yes to it. Right. So like that's an example of the collective intelligence actually being kind of stupid. Like the collective intelligence is failing to, yeah. But I wonder if there is a third type of thing and what to do about that third type of thing, where in fact, the type of sense that it made to do the thing somehow is perceivable by 5 people at once, but not by you.
Actually, that was what I thought you were talking about initially, because I've had this experience quite a few
Right.
times.
I was just sort of like naming some versions that aren't that. But then there's this thing. What do?
I mean, I don't know. So I'm reminded of many, many times at CFAR where we would get together and decide, yeah, so let's like design this kind of program for this workshop, and let's talk to these people and then create all this kind of stuff. And like, yeah, okay, so let's like empower each person to feel like they can do what they think makes sense here. And like, yeah, like do each of you feel like you have a sensible place to start? Yeah, we've got these sensible places to start. And then I go off into my office and I would sit down, and there'd just be this feeling of, now what? And there's this weirdness of, I can see the steps, but somehow I can't feel them anymore. Now, I don't really know what's going on there, but I can make some guesses looking back.
Yeah.
I think part of it was that I was feeling the hope that is shared of what we could do if this project were to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
And that hopefulness was part of the fuel I was experiencing. Once
Mm-hmm.
I was no longer physically with them and I wasn't exchanging the sense of social energy and I was left on my own to do my piece, there's the lived sense of kind of intuitively knowing that that's not how CFAR has worked before. So I don't have the anticipation feelings of, if I do this and I put the and I build this project and I send it off to this person, then a magic thing happens. Even if
Yeah.
it's true, I do not have that feeling.
Yeah.
And so there's no affordance pathway for me to do anything. And it's almost like the computation didn't finish while we were in the group. And now that I'm
Yeah.
on my own, I'm just a gear spinning in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that feels to me like a great instance of, like, when you say the computation didn't finish, I would say exactly right. Like, what's going on there is, by my read, that there was some part of you that actually didn't trust the apparent optimism and gung-ho-ness of the group. Wanted to, and so didn't sort of like, guys, because sort of was like hoping that by kind of, yeah, everybody hunt the stag, right? Yeah, everybody's gonna hunt the stag for sure. We're totally gonna do it. Right? Like, you got to hype everybody up to get them to hunt the stag is like the idea, but that's like naive trust, right? Like that's not actually integrating all the stuff. And so what you guys maybe actually needed was something more like, you and anyone else who was sitting with something similar being able to voice that, and then to be able to kind of go, okay, yeah, well, but like, geez, it sure would be nice if we could do it this new kind of way. Well, how can we slowly iterate towards that? Like, can we make a thing that we feel, more non-naively hopeful about, or sort of more kind of like something that's at our actual capacity to go off alone, do a thing, and come back together and be like, hey, check it out, we did the thing, right?
Yeah. It feels like I find myself wanting to say two things at the same time. I guess the meta thing is important to lead with. I feel a little bit like you had changed the subject from what we had talked an hour about, which is fine. It feels like you're trying to go in some kind of direction. I'm sort of following your lead.
Cool.
But because I can't tell where you're going, I'm not sure what does and doesn't belong as feedback.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
and so,
How to
but that's
steer.
okay. But
Yep.
that's just where I am. So with that caveat, it seems maybe worth mentioning, because I can't
Yep.
tell what is and is not worth mentioning here. That in the context of CFAR in particular, one of the things that I learned to track is casting doubt on the group's ability to enthuse enough about going for stag would guarantee that we would not have the internal momentum to do it. So
Right.
that conversational pathway was not actually available.
Um, uh, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that's fairly typical. And like uh, reversing that norm is part of what the NNTD is all about. Like making a lot of space for it to be an exciting move for somebody to be like, I don't trust what's happening right now. Like having that be like, okay, cool. Well, good thing we got that out now. Like something like that. And part of what's required to get that is for there to not be a sense of like sort of rushing. It's like the idea.
I laugh because was made of rushing everything. I cut your internet or it cut mine. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure whose that was. You're laughing because CFAR was made of rushing.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and so it's like, in some ways, like there's a bunch of circular stuff here. Like, how do you deal with the rushing if you don't have time to deal with the rush? Like, how do you deal with the rushing pattern if you don't have time to deal with the rushing pattern? How do you talk about the fact that the rushing pattern's in the way if the rushing pattern is saying like, hey, we can't talk about things that are in the way because we've got to just go do the thing already?
It wasn't quite that bad, but I hear the thing that you're pointing at.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. So let's so the question, something that I'm uncertain about, I think this gets us back to our original conversation. The thing that I am uncertain about is whether all cases of group comes into some sort of clarity of what it makes sense to do as a collective agent, which it claims to be, and then goes off and like bees a bunch of like solo agents who then are somehow mysteriously out of touch with the collective thing. The question is, do all of those reduce to the kind of thing we're talking about here, where in fact the collective agent was being a bit of a dumbass and not listening to critique, like, concerns that its participants had? In which case, if we designed a collective agent that was adequately able to consistently integrate those concerns, it would never experience the phenomenon of the people go off on their own and then they're like, or is it the case? Yeah.
I was just imagining if that is the case, that in a non-dumbass collective intelligence that never happens.
Mm-hmm.
This this begs to summon Goodhart's demon. Like knowing that in order to design a culture.
Oh, are you saying if you aimed at that?
Right, because if like that is such a clear signal that it could be like, oh, like anytime this happens, let's bring it in and talk about it. Man, it just never happens. So I guess we're doing great. Oh shit. Anyway, sorry. You said you were going to give another possibility that was more intelligent than, or not that.
Well, so I mean, the other possibility is that in some sense, sometimes you perceive a thing that makes sense, and in order to perceive it, you needed 5 people all looking at it at once from their different vantage points, and then you could see it. And then, like, in fact, that thing is just not seeable. But I guess, so in that case, you might still not have the problem I'm describing on a pragmatic level. You might go off on your own. You
Right.
still can't see the whole, but you trust the whole.
Yeah.
Like no part of you is
That
at
makes sense.
odds with the whole.
Yeah. The key thing, from what I can tell, is the feeling that you need to take action as an individual that is part of the superorganism, but you somehow don't know what to do, or it feels like the actions that you do know how to do are unhelpful or anti-helpful.
Or would
Like,
undermine your
if you-
own something in some way.
Right. And so like that's the structure of the problem.
Yeah.
If the problem is, if you have this experience of, all right, this is the thing that we like, if you're seeing it clearly, I could imagine something where you come together, you get clarity on the thing, you then go apart, and then one of you goes, wait, what? Bird jeeby derby derb? And then like you come back and go, what? And then it goes shunk. Oh, that happened. That's interesting. So let's account for that in this whole thing. And
then
I get it. Right. So here's the new instruction. Yes, that makes sense. And what you would know is it works because pop, you go apart. And then this person who was confused before is still confused, but not about what to do.
Yeah. Right. So bringing this back to our earlier conversation about whether there are unfathomable things above us, the question, like part of what pragmatically, so like I'm not that interested in the aliens question personally. I'm very interested in the 5 people make a decision about what they're going to do next. Can they execute on it? And not just make a decision, because that's actually, if they make a decision, then they're doing like decide-y energy. It's 5 people come to an obvious thing to do together. Can they go execute on it?
Yeah, the synergy thing of, obviously. Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah. There's an example energy type that I don't know how universal it is, but until I find other examples, I'll pretend it's universal. The thing where what it means for a collective intelligence to decide something, at least in this sort of Gen 3 flavored way, has this quality of, you sort of look around and go, oh, did we just do it? Because like the solution is clear in your mind for what each person wants to do. And then you just check and write, all right. And you can trust that that's what will happen because you all just shared the computation that that's what each of you wants.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And there's like this trippy common knowledge thing that occurs. For listeners watching at home, we have another video about that I will link down below under common knowledge tipping points. I forget what it's called, but it'll have a name, something like that. Or click moments. Cool. So I don't care that much about the aliens question, but I am very interested in the question if the question of whether the kinds of collective intelligences that that you and I are intending to create in our lifetimes will experience issues of the kind that we were talking about in the sort of argument phase of like, unfathomable upward something. And it sort of seems
just to clarify, there was a little bit of object-subject slippage in the grammatical structure of that sentence. I want to check. Did you mean that you care a lot about the whether the collective intelligence needs to account for things that it cannot orient to above it?
I have not gotten that far.
Okay, that's what I thought you said.
Yeah, no.
I was like, okay.
Like that is an interesting question and does not seem pertinent. That feels a little bit like, what color shall we paint the bike shed on Mars? I'm just like, we have earlier questions.
I was wondering, but it's like, man, if you think that's the question, I wanna hear where your chair is, man, because like
Well, it is actually a really interesting question now that you've highlighted it. Like, I'm glad you've named it because there's something sort of neat about that. It's like we can imagine one stage up. We've participated in things that feel a little bit like that, right? And they have these properties and whatnot. But then it's like, what is the blind spot of that thing, right? And I think in practice, a lot of this is going to involve just like figuring out the communications technology and information, like my current read is that for the most part, we don't have an information problem right now in a certain sense. We have a collective cognition interface problem. And that once we solve that, like once we have 1,000 agents who are all capable of doing the Gen 3 dance, then we have an information problem. And we have 1,000 people who want to solve it. And break into teams that will be very effective at the scale that we can currently do information processing. So I'm not really worried about that. I just like, yeah. But the current puzzle is just like, how do you get like a number of people who can coordinate in this new way at any scale, at the scale that they do have like adequate information flow in a sort of physical sense.
Admittedly, I don't have that experience of that kind of coordination with very many people at all.
Mm-hmm.
I've had it with a bare few individuals, and it's also easier to get on very mechanical tasks, like barn raisings are a very classic example of this type of thing. Which, like, I feel like that really does, you can feel those examples coming together because there's a common knowledge, shared physical goal that everyone can see and understand.
Yeah, and the goal is in the environment. The goal is in the environment, so there's relatively minimal needing to loop through the individual's needs and find like win-wins. The win-wins are on the scale of, hey, if you carry that end of this thing and I carry this end, it'll be twice as easy. It'll be more than twice as easy as each of us carrying one of the whatever's over there. Like, sound like a win-win to you? Sure does to me. All right, let's pick it up. Like, and all of that happens wordlessly when it's flowing well. But sort of that's the level of win-wins that are involved. They're not very deep. They're not very creative. They're not like, they don't involve that click depth perception moment for the most part.
I still want to get, I'm coming, as I reflect on it, I would love to get a sort of, even a small library, or maybe a bookcase rather than a library, but like a collection of clear examples of more interesting types, or even that level would also be useful, but I'm particularly
like more case studies of it.
Just the raw case studies. Like, 'cause the only one that comes clearly to mind for me was the way that Cecile and I broke up. That had very clearly this nature to it, and it was very graceful. And I want more of that in my life everywhere. Not breaking up, but like
but that kind of thing where like you surface everything into the center, and then it's apparent to both of you what makes sense, and you're like, well, okay, good then.
Right.
Cool. I guess that's what we're doing. And in this case, what we were doing was becoming less of a we, but there was still a sense of common seeing of that, and in that there was actually profound we-ness to the whole thing. There was
an enormous same-sidedness in the process of each person needed to go through a kind of grieving process for the we that had died as a result of that seeing, and etc. So like it was even, there's still a we, it's just the we that evolved was deeper and truer. So I just want more examples like that.
Well, let's start by you writing that one up. Because I would like to have that case study available for myself as well. I'm very much in favor of creating such a library as well. So maybe maybe we could make a tiny project of just like something like a Google Doc that just has links to anything that's a case study like this on various levels.
Sure, that sounds messy and ill-defined. That's a better place to start than what we currently have.
Great. I am going to make such a Google Doc.
Awesome.
Um, and case studies of what? What are these case studies of? What am I naming this Google Doc? What is this
Uh,
library?
I don't know, like intelligent co-decisions.
Um, uh,
Collaborative concluding.
okay, I'm calling it for now Library of Intelligent Co-Decision / Collaborative Conclusions. And because I'm calling it library, we can just refer to it as the library. And then if we decide that it should be a library of something else, then it'll still be the library of whatever.
Sounds good.
Okay. List of examples. Oh, there's some excellent little ones. Uh, in a paper about virtual bargaining, which you will absolutely want to read this paper. Um, uh, uh, the paper talks about the idea that a lot of how humans coordinate is by each simulating what they would do if they were to negotiate out loud, and then if they come to a confident conclusion, just doing it. And they use, as an example, the case study of two people moving a table. And they note that it's quite common. They note that, like, if people are starting at either ends of the table, they will just like pick up the end that they're next to. And that also, if they're starting sort of both near one corner, they'll each move to the the location that minimizes the total movement distance, which is interesting, right? It's not lazy. It's lazy on behalf of the collective, not on behalf of the individual.
Yeah.
It's not, oh, I'm going to go to the closest one to me. Like, they don't both try to go to the one that they're each closest to. They minimize the collective movement distance. Very interesting. This is like obvious when you just watch people behave. And then they even note that if you had a situation with a despot, like, some, aggressive ruler or whatever, and a servant, where the despot's will sort of always wins, then in that situation, even if the despot and the servant are both slightly close to one end of the table, and the but the servant is slightly closer to that end, the servant may nonetheless move all the way around to the far end of the table so that the despot doesn't have to move as far. Like, if that's in fact sort of what would be negotiated if they were to talk about it, which, and that they would also both just do this without having to say it, because they both know that that's what would happen if they were to negotiate. And so it's cool in that it captures not just sort of collaborative instances, but also instances where there is a strong, gradient of will or power or whatever. But there is still a superorganismness to the entity, like
Yeah, it feels like it's describing something about how the interface between humans works automatically, like what the signaling actually is. That's neat.
Yeah,
I don't know what to make of it yet. That does tickle my interest.
Yeah, it's a really cool paper, and it's been cited on many times. So it's there's there's a whole world of academic literature out there of people trying to understand questions in the spaces adjacent to ours. Turns out um, I'm I'm becoming slightly excited about cognitive science academia, which is
I was
I was
just
not
thinking, this
expecting to
sounds
become.
like this sounds almost like Verbeke might not be a fluke. That's interesting.
That was kind of the thought that I had when I read this paper. I was like, this is, geez, this people are, yeah.
Yeah, when I studied cognitive science for as a subsection of my PhD stuff, it mostly sounded like people having fun with random philosophy things without verifying anything. But yeah,
Yeah.
this sounds much more heavy. So
Yeah.
I mentioned that in part because it might be a specific subsection, a cultural subsection of academic cognitive
Of
science.
the cog sci scene. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Totally.
I have one other topic that's related to our original thread.
Great.
So this feels like a good moment to gear shift.
Yeah.
Um,
Agreed.
I've been chewing on the possibility that what it means to embody the, like I'm thinking about how like the kind of interface with other humans shift that's required to do the thing that does the collective intelligence converging on that other evolutionary choice of actually honoring the etc. So which is like a fancy painted up way of saying Gen 3. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
But at least we hope so. It seems convergent.
For anybody listening at home, we're talking about the third generation of human operating system, the first two having been sort of the hunter-gatherer-ish phase, and the second being the authoritarian phase.
Yeah, although that's H1, H2, H3, which is like
well,
we assume maps over, but
yeah,
because the gen has to do with the generation of mimetic operating system, where Gen 1 is a reference to language.
Okay, sorry. So Gen 1 is a reference to language, and then what's Gen 2?
Gen 2 is the sort of epiphenomenal shame-based system where you end up having imposed ideas and idea structures that move between people.
Right. Interesting.
You're actually you start to build out this structure that is based on primarily, I would say, trauma infrastructure.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, appreciating that distinction there. Interesting balance between like using jargon we both know and just rolling with it versus like explaining stuff. But then this also like helped me get a little different insight into how you were framing stuff, which I had been sort of taking for granted. So that was cool. Anyway.
So in terms of embodying the more Gen 3 flavored stuff, it strikes me that like there's a question that it currently feels very simple, and I haven't stared at it long enough to desimplify it. But I'm looking at the thing of, I guess there are two questions. One is this ongoing thing of who am I as I make this shift more completely? Am I the collective that is doing the thinking, just working through this Michael? Am I Michael? And it feels like there's a relevant question there. And this relates to the other thing, which is, well, what does it mean to care for the lower order bits? And I'm doing this in a very complex way because what I'm staring at is actually a relatively simple question. One way to say the thing I'm staring at is, does embodying the Gen 3 thing require me to care about my organs and my cells and so on the same way that the superorganism would care about the humans?
Right, which gets us back to some of our earlier things about.
Yeah, which doesn't necessarily mean, oh, well, I don't do anything that could scrape off skin cells. But there is something about the casualness with which we scrape off skin cells that I could imagine a fully mature version of Gen 3 actually requiring us to have emotional orientation to and to be tracking.
Oh, wow. Yeah, interesting. So I had never considered that. Um, and I I can see there being something helpful potentially involved in that, in terms of it being a kind of almost like pragmatic animism, um, like that there's something that it does to feel the reality of the aliveness of your own. I mean, in some cases, the skin cells are already dead at the point when they're scraped off, I believe. There's like a layer of dead cells on top of the living ones.
Sure, but we could talk
But
about
anyway,
things like me burning the roof of my mouth
right.
with the pizza.
Yeah.
Like that's
At any rate, yeah. So, um, but on another level, I'm not sure. Like, like the cells. So it's like, should I care about my thermostat? Like, not all homeostatic processes are um moral patients or something. I'm confused
well,
about this, but
I am kind of wondering if that's something like an error.
right.
Because so what I'm
That's
thinking
kind of what I
about
hear you
doesn't mean
wondering.
to care.
Right.
There's a question of if I care about my thermostat, that doesn't mean I treat my thermostat like a human, because it doesn't care whether I give it compliments, because it
Right.
can't register that. So, but there is something to track what it means to, like if I were that thermostat, what would I be caring about? And is there a way that I could support it in that? It's very weird when you're talking about a thermostat, literally.
No,
I feel like it's more
but I think
intuitive when I'm talking about cells.
right, but I think reducing it down to thermostat is like helpful for getting clear on what the fuck we're talking about here. It like because you know, it's the sort of the simplest homeostatic process, and it's one that we created, and we know it's um I'm not going to say we know it's not conscious, because that depends on what the fuck you mean by conscious, but like it is we know that it's not more than 1 bit complex because we only programmed it to have 1 bit. Maybe put it that way. um you know, a thermostat that controls both a furnace and an air conditioning is 2 bits conscious. um
Twice as conscious.
wow. um so
Maybe 4 times as conscious.
Where was I going with this? Oh no. So, but I think there's an important, distinction here, though, which I also, yeah, going all the way back to this being, you know, a sort of responding in any way to this podcast that we listened to. I had a sense of frustration where I felt like I was hearing them equivocate between things that are not the same. They were basically saying that 3 things were the same, as far as I could tell, and they seemed to be being quite precise about this. They were using the colloquial English term stress, not otherwise more precisely specified than that. They were equivocating that to cybernetic error, and they were equivocating that to dukkha. I think a thermostat is not experiencing dukkha. I really am like.
I think that is so. There is a fuzziness here of something like, I mean, what I understood them to be suggesting is that dukkha is an emergent, like, I may be adding more detail than they were even thinking about, but what I took from what they were describing is that possibly dukkha is the emergent experience of a subjective being as a result of error. The error experienced of their overall systems in the way that it goes upward. So in that sense, it seems to me like I think that if you could experience the world as a thermostat, then if you were to call something dukkha, it would be the error.
Right.
I think so, that's fine.
I think that's a claim someone could make, and not claiming to be a Buddhist scholar, I'm pretty sure that's not what dukkha is. Um,
There's something, just as a side note, there's something about the way that you're pronouncing it that reminds me of Team America World Police, where the, where the Middle Eastern people they were showing around kept saying dukkha, 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 dukkha.
dukkha?
Yeah, I think they were pronouncing it like dukkha or something like that.
Okay.
But anyway,
Yeah.
there was something about the way you're pronouncing it that was sparking that in my memory. Anyway, setting that aside now.
Yeah. So one of the reasons, so I've got a few things here. So like, Buddha says something like, existence is suffering, but he also says there's a way out of suffering, and it turns out that this is not the 45 solution. If
Yes,
error were synonymous with suffering, then that would be the only solution.
yes,
Period.
you are you are correct. There was a yeah, I watched that thought flicker through my mind today while I was listening to that part where I was thinking about, well, then what is this cessation of suffering business about then? But
Yeah.
I didn't finish thinking about that because I was listening to the rest of the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're just right.
Yeah, it's like if you can have a cessation of suffering, if Buddhism is pointing at anything useful and not just saying something tautological or whatever, then if you can have a cessation of suffering without a cessation of life, and I mean life, not just experience, because homeostasis does not require any particular loopiness of experience, then dukkha can't be the same as error. I've jammed with a few other PCT Buddhist PCT nerds or whatever about this question, and a couple of us independently converged on something like dukkha is the belief you shouldn't have error.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that just when you say that, I just like, oh yeah, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, common belief. Like, terrible. I have problems. Why are things not already forever the way that I wish that they were?
Yeah. So the Buddha's answer is get over yourself.
Yeah. And yeah. And so then in this sense, it's like the thermostat, I'm pointing at my AC unit up here. The thermostat like does not have a system that is capable of believing that it shouldn't have error. It just doesn't have one of those. I think this is also true of our cells.
Sure.
They have like error and homeostatic processes, but I don't think they have an extra loop being like, geez, we should have like, even if they're doing advanced planning or something, like somehow predicting and modeling gradients into the future, that's still probably happening in a linear way, not in a loopy way that is like, like beating itself up with a second arrow for not having already solved the whatever.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like you pulled in their pulling in of Buddhism, and now we're talking about suffering because that's a thing that Buddhism does.
Right.
And
yeah,
then this is getting folded into this thing of care, and I am struck with the fact that my intuitions around care are not made of orientation to suffering. They relate to suffering, but when I think of things like, what does it mean to care about the cat? And like sometimes the cat, like mom and dad's cat will be sitting downstairs, just sort of looking out the window, and I'll sort of sneak up to her and then pet her and ruffle her fur, and she just loves that.
Right, and it's not because she was suffering previously.
No,
yeah,
there's no suffering involved in any of that, and I still think this was really good. And like, it's like what it means to care for the cat, and it's like
yeah.
And I'm sort of orienting to the extent that I I have a kind of loose intuition that could use some precision at some point.
Mhm.
I could
Yeah, yeah.
stand staring at this, but something like I think that adopting Gen 3 means something like identifying as Gen 3. Like there's a kind of identity shift that happens there. Oh, our connection looks like
Yeah,
it's doing
no,
a
I think I heard you. The video, they managed to just
okay.
drop the video. Um, so
Okay.
I'm broadly with you, and I want to just like first tag something else I think is really important here, which is you brought in this thing about like the super organism sees out of our own eyes, and I really love that. There's something about like you sort of identify with the whole, but you don't not identify with self. Like it's a both
Right.
and at the same time,
Right.
and the whole is you, and yeah.
Yeah, and I still have some really big questions there about what, like, how does that work? How can I both be Michael and be all of humanity? And there's like some confusion currently in my brain, which I think is registering the degree to which I have not actually completed this transformation. But
Yep.
in any case, the possibility I'm looking at is, well, if I, as Gen 3,
Hmm.
would care about Michael, uh, it seems plausible that the mechanism by which that caring works will do the same thing for maybe literally all beings. And that's going to go all the way to like Michael's lungs, because that's part of Michael's system, but also the care. Like there's something about, in order for it to be recursively stable, I think part of where the intuition I'm pulling from here is something like the type of thinking, the type of problems that Miri was trying to solve. Like how do you
Mm.
get human stable, how do you get any stable values to continue under iterations of an ongoing super intelligence?
Right,
And I think,
right, yeah.
and let alone pro-human ones. And I'm looking at this going, well, I think part of what we're doing here is, without having analyzed any of Miri's technical thinking, or hardly any of it, a little bit, but not enough to count.
Mhm.
I think in effect what we're doing is we are trying to answer this problem by building the intelligence out of the thing defining friendliness.
Yes. Yep.
Um, and then when I'm looking at that and I'm going, well, under the recursive iteration of it continuing to become ever more super
Mm.
intelligent, in order for that to work, the seed of the recursion seems like the base case has to go down. And this here I'm being loose with my intuitions,
Yep,
but it's
yep.
something like it's going to care about me to the extent that I care about the levels below me,
Right. No, no, I see what
because
you're
I
pointing at
am
here.
it.
Yeah, yeah. Yep, yep. No, I'm broadly with you here. Yeah. And my talking about whether or not cells suffer um was not intended to counter what you were saying. It was just attempting to establish what are we talking about when we're talking about cells. Um, the this is really beautiful. I love it. And yeah, as you note, like caring for your cell, doesn't. I mean, first of all, like the cell is going to die before you do, probably, right? And oh, that's actually a weird thought. Yeah, if though you got in an accident tomorrow and died, like the cell would like outlive you by a few minutes or whatever, however long until it took till this. Interesting. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, not that relevant. The thing I want to highlight is that we're actually looking at two scales. There's two different directions of down, as far as I can tell, maybe more. One of them is down to lower levels of biological complexity. Reducing yourself down to cells.
Yeah.
The cells have, their little mitochondria and the other little sub agents in them. Up above the cells, you've got organs, right? Like that's one axis of going down, and that's biological. And each of those layers has homeostatic processes. The other direction of going down is uh, perceptual cognitive. It's the PCT hierarchy. basically.
Sure.
And so, and I would say that one is the same as the like going down that it is to care about your IFS parts.
Yeah.
And um, and within the frame of IFS, it can sometimes feel like, oh wow, are these whole other beings that are within me that have their own, selfhood or something? And the answer is like kind of, but like don't port all your intuitions about individuals to those. um, from a PCT perspective, it becomes more clear that in essence, like I can have a goal that I'm working towards homeostatically one day, and then the next day, for whatever reason, maybe the goal becomes impossible because it's like, goal, talk to this person this often, and then the person dies. Or, it's a goal related to a relationship that I no longer have, or it's a goal related to a project that actually then somebody else goes and solves. And I'm actually, oh, I don't have to deal with that anymore. Or it's just actually like the goal is achieved and I let go of it, right? In any of these cases, there's a sense in which like I have a homeostatic something that matters. It's made out of matteringness, in fact. And also its matteringness is subject to an upward and downward flow of reorganization. And it might cease to be without anyone having died, or without any death on a biological scale. Sure. All the neurons participating in that are now reorganized for other purposes and blah blah blah, and or not necessarily even reorganized, but like they are no longer holding the reference level that they were previously holding. And there's also just like, I guess, to crib from Buddhism, I don't know how accurately or not, there's the arising and passing of every perception that shows up in experience. That like there's a momentary consciousness that I have of my hands being in the air, and then my hands are down, and then I have a perception of some other world, and each of those is flowing, and I have a thought that I think of to share, or whatever, or this is a little bit paradoxical, but like a moment ago, I happened to look out the window and I saw some gigantic leaves here that were salient in their gigantic greenness. And that momentary awareness would have been lost forever if I hadn't just now gone and wanted an example of something that sort of would have been lost forever. And as it is, it's now memorialized forever into this conversation. I might as well show what the leaves look like since I've mentioned them. But like I've had a perception before, which I think is very, very similar, Michael, to what you're pointing at. I've had a perception before of, oh, every thought I have is sacred. Like they are all sacred. And if I have a thought that's starting to go, in a direction that some larger part of me is going, that's not the place that we're going right now. There's a very meaningful difference between being like, whatever, shut up, like internally, versus being like, nope, not that. We're going to do this. But thank you, though. Like there's like an attitude, and it doesn't have to waste time being thankful any more than, telling it to shut up is wasting time telling it to shut up. Like all of those are just like verbal descriptions of a basic attitude that is effectively instant in either case anyway. Yeah. I felt you'd be touched when I said every thought is sacred, and I want to just create some space for that.
Thank you. It is touching something. It's deepening an existential sense, something very beautiful. It's making something make sense in a way it's not very intellectual at all. It's just a feeling sense of what it means to bring love and care to literally everything, and the places where it feels like that's not a capacity that this human is yet able to really do,
Hmm.
um, but feeling the direction of that, and the beauty and importance of it.
Hmm.
So those are some words associated with the feeling touched.
Cool. I found myself playfully wanting to say something like, on behalf of the larger whole, uh, your ability and inability to do this and your inclinations thereabouts are also all sacred.
That feels really good. Thank you.
What does it mean to be speaking on behalf of the larger whole? I actually there's something beautiful there too, which is oh, you may be frozen.
Connections being glitchy. Hold on.
Oh,
Okay, you're back.
cool.
You're back.
We are back. We is the thing that is back.
The we is back.
Yeah. Yeah. I was here the whole time. You were here and you're here the whole time. Um and but we is back now. Um uh um oh yeah, there's like, what does it mean to speak on behalf of the whole? Oh yeah. I was at an airport the other day, and the airline was doing something really dumb in terms of how they were like getting people into the lines. The details are not interesting, but the point is, it was systematically confusing and frustrating every single passenger who approached. And there was some small changes that they could have made that would have like made it not do that. And I tried to explain to them, like, if you put a cord in here, then it wouldn't like, then you wouldn't have people, blah blah blah. Anyway, and so people were confused and frustrated and annoyed and felt like they were being unnecessarily delayed, although in fact they weren't. They were just being confused and apparently delayed. But I didn't sort of realize that until afterwards. Anyway, and so they were like muttering to each other like this, and I went over to them and I said, "Hey, I just want to apologize to you on behalf of the universe for this user experience here. Like, this could be way better, and it doesn't make any sense. I see your confusion and the fact that you're like, this doesn't make any sense, and I agree, it in fact doesn't make any sense. On behalf of the universe, I'm sorry." And it's like being willing to identify with the whole and say, I am sorry, we've not figured this little thing here out with the airline check-in thing for you right now, and your frustration is legitimate. I see it. Like, in some sense, this is the thing that sort of maybe bridges between the apologetic sorry and the empathetic sorry, like the sympathetic sorry, right? It's like, on behalf of the universe, man, sorry you have to go through this. Although I do think there's a difference between like something like, I see specifically why you're upset, and like, I think we could do better, in fact, versus like, yes, death is a reality of whatever, or like loss. Like, we're never going to be able to get rid of loss. That would be right. But like, there's something where it's like sometimes a loss hits you sort of too soon. Like, you're sort of in some really important sense not ready, and like, on behalf of the universe, like, I'm sorry that it was timed like that and you weren't able to like, and that it's hitting you so fast, like, and that's a slightly more precise thing that I'm probably not going to say to anybody at a funeral anytime soon, because it's like sort of weirdly technical, um yeah.
there's some place in me that's looking forward in a sort of macabre way to the kind of future where that actually makes sense for you to say. Like, not, I mean, the circumstances that would have to come together for that to happen would be mildly horrendous, but uh, net, I think it would be quite good. Like, it would require that we had built up enough of a culture that, yeah.
And what I found is that with a lot of these things, like, I am a very verbal dude, as you are, and a lot of these things, we can put very precise language to them. which is cool. And sometimes that precise language is not the thing that the scene needs. But having clarified it that precisely can allow us or others to inhabit a stance that is actually embodying exactly that precise sentiment and only says a couple of words about it or from it, but still communicates something of that basic stance. So I think like, you know, in a more graceful way, this stuff is actually can be showing up very, very immediately.
Yeah.
Oh.
Good stuff.
So you're becoming quite dark. I've got one or
I
two
can be
more.
less dark temporarily, but I am going to need to start winding down pretty soon.
No, that makes sense. I've got a couple other pieces I'm interested in bringing in from my notes on the podcast. Insofar as we want to have this be sort of one self-contained conversation on that front.
Only have one conversation about this podcast. After that,
yeah. Anyway, so one of them is I noticed I have it marked as like an hour and 13 minutes in, sort of a contradiction. I want to be clear. I have a couple of like sort of like big critiques of this, but I really appreciate the thing being good enough to be like to warrant these critiques. Because so much of what it was really cool. So he's talking about like developing a science of consciousness, and the weird thing about it is like unlike other sciences, it can't sort of output numbers; it's got to output poetry, right? Like what?
right.
And so, but then he was saying like ultimately, in order to understand subjectivity, like poetry isn't enough either. You'd want to fuse or meld with it. But this seems to me like a contradiction because at the point when you've done that, the original thing that you were trying to understand no longer exists. Like, I can't understand what it's like to be you talking with me by fusing with you. Then I would only have what it's like to be us thinking together with our collective brain in the way that we now are using like wires or tubes or God forbid Bluetooth. You know, likewise, like I can't understand what it's like to be, you know, my partner when she's having sex with me by fusing with her brain. Like if we had a like deep brain interface to the point where we were sharing qualia alive, I would then just understand this is what it's like to be this fused us, you know, engaged in sex together. Like, but that's it. Yeah.
I felt like part of like I actually really liked that part of the discussion, but I felt like on that particular spot there was a little bit of
like a slip
of extra hopping that didn't need to happen.
Yeah.
Like I thought almost all of the value was highlighted by the question. Like noticing there's there's actually a science of consciousness has to be a fundamentally different type from these others because the data type that you would want to investigate is so different that you can tell that numbers would not be adequate.
Yeah.
Numbers can at best point at the type of data that you actually care about, but like what's the data that you actually care about?
Yeah.
And there is something interesting about the fact that when you start exploring what a science of consciousness in its understanding would be, you can't have like where I thought he was going to go. And I was sort of like, and like the thing about fusion is sort of like, oh, this is like your shtick. So instead I'm going to give my shtick, you know. But it seemed like the slip there was something like where I thought he was going to go was about the data needing to be in first person.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and which is your shtick.
Yes, that's my shtick. But and like I'm much more general about it because I think doing the brain fusion thing is an interesting way of answering part of the question. I didn't think of the thing that you're talking about where that actually changes what you're getting the subjective experience of. But I think part of that is because he was thinking of using gap junctions. And it does seem to me like there are, I don't know, like when I'm watching the cats and I'm getting a sense of what's going on in their little brains, um, it seems like I can get a pretty high degree of tracking a lot of how it is like to be them on the inside, enough that I can anticipate their movements and I can imagine what they like and dislike, and I
Mhm.
can notice, oh, you found this almost enjoyable, but this part was annoying, huh?
Yeah.
And like I can get really precise about that kind of stuff, and I don't think the cat has anything even vaguely approaching that experience of me,
Mhm.
right? um, I wouldn't be surprised if the cat even can't track that I am tracking her, right? So there's it seems to me like there, but my experience of that is still very first person in a very important way.
First
But
person
because
to the cat.
yeah, because what I have to
Yep.
do is create a
Yep. Yep.
simulation
Yep.
of being the cat inside
Yep.
of my own experience in order to run that. So um, so that seems to me like an example type in the direction that I think I thought that's where he was going to go, and he just wanted to talk about fusing brains instead.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
This
And
whole thing
I,
with fusing brains kind of drove me nuts because I was staring at it going, that's not how brains interface.
yeah, you're sort of, yeah, he's, I think, a little bit stuck in the biological frame for the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's a reason that I don't know exactly what the reason is, but there's a reason that human beings and brains are about as big as they are. Some sort of energy efficiency frontier, like, and also a bit of like there's like physical limitations in terms of like how big you can make a being that lumbers around, larger than us and like heavier than us, and it starts to look like an elephant. In terms of the cube square law. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's not how brains interface. We're going to be able to do some cool shit with BCIs for sure, right? And like that solves the heat sink problem and the like that. This is so this is going to be one frontier. There are going to be people who do mind melding via hard technology, right?
Yep.
That's going to be a whole world. That's not what I'm mostly interested in. I don't know how far I will delve into that world.
That world's going to have
Yeah.
really damn weird interfacing with the collective intelligence thing.
It'll be very weird. Yeah.
I've not even started thinking about that. I'm just noticing.
Yeah, I barely have either.
We built a fucking huge, powerful left hemisphere, and now we're going to plug it in.
Yep.
I don't think this is going to go like anyone's expecting.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's gonna, man, God, it's gonna be so fucking weird. That's all I have to say about that. But yeah. So the first personness, I have found, like, I suspect that a decent exercise in the course of trying to do some WeSpace practices based around the sorts of things that uh, the sorts of things that we're interested in. Like, I suspect a decent warm-up exercise to that could literally be you sit across from someone and you just literally imagine what the world looks like out of their eyes. And you're like, okay, so I'm looking at you. You are seeing me. It looks kind of like I would expect when I look at myself in the mirror, except you're not seeing selfness, you're seeing otherness. Okay. So you're seeing an experience of Malcolm that's got otherness to him. Okay, neat. What am I wearing? Like what are you seeing? What's behind me that you're seeing that I can't see, right? Like, and just literally just like, and eyes are great for this because unlike ears and smells, they are very pointy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I really love this, particularly this element of, because I don't think I've ever done this before. This, like, imagining, like I've imagined through someone else's eyes before and tried to get a sense of their lived experience. But when I am simulating their experience of me, there's still this ping of the fact that I'm looking at the simulation and I am that thing, but really emphasizing the otherness.
Yeah.
Like that's not an element I've done before. That is interesting.
Yeah, they are looking at me and I am an unknown. Like I am, they don't
Yeah,
know what it's like on the inside of me the way I do.
right. Yeah. Yeah, that is cool. It actually highlights a place where I can now track that I was doing a simplification of the recursive reasoning.
Ah,
Because
yeah.
there's something interesting about if you're sitting across from a partner and you two are doing this exercise
At the
at
same
the
time.
same time.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm looking at you, looking at me, looking at you, looking at me.
Yep.
I'm thinking about you, thinking about me, thinking about you, thinking about me. I'm feeling you, feeling me, feeling you, feeling me. Yeah.
And thus Eliezer's pants went to DC.
Right. And so then there's a whole question of like the recursion, pragmatically the recursion bottoms out. But there also seems to be a certain thing where where I think you can practice doing the recursive version, but I'm gonna just blindly speculate here or something, that doing that practice builds the muscle that does a perspective taking version of common knowledge,
Yeah.
that is able to just hold
Yeah. I can actually
the
speak from
whole.
some I can speak from some personal experience on this. I didn't used to think in terms of this recursive reasoning consciously almost at all, except from the basic social thing of what do you think she thinks about me?
Yeah.
Which is like, well, I would guess she's thinking blah 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 blah. And then and like Jane Austen type stuff is like a real brain stretcher, right?
Right. Yeah.
God, everybody has opinions about people's opinions about people's opinions about things. Holy fuck! But after listening to Critch talk about this type of stuff, where he was describing things about awkwardness being about tracking and social savvy being about tracking different layers of social recursion, and the game theory that's involved in common knowledge, like seeing all of that and then consciously tracking it and starting to work with that, it worked a muscle in me that actually made it easier for me to track Jane Austen type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that this was essential foundational cognitive work for me to do to be able to reason in terms of self-reference, which I believe was an essential component of, like, whenever you run into infinite recursion in a finite system like a biological being,
Mm-hmm.
usually what you're actually encountering is self-reference that you are framing as recursion.
Right. Yep.
So you can get this effect of folding the recursion infinitely in on itself, which is not really what you're doing, but you're getting the self-reference to fully refer to itself in your own models of the thing you're looking at. And then
Right.
the picture sort of folds together, which I'm doing some hand waving here, but a lot of times I think the thing that's going on with common knowledge, like the reason common knowledge feels different is that although you want to formally model it as an infinite chain of common knowledge, in practice, what's actually happened is we know this.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. And
we knows this might be
yeah,
a way of saying it.
And the pronouns and conjugations get all funky. I randomly somehow came across a Wikipedia article. I don't know how I ended up with this open, but an open tab I have right now that I haven't actually really read yet is called Grounding in Communication. And it says it's a concept proposed by these people a few decades ago. It comprises the collection of mutual knowledge, mutual beliefs, and mutual assumptions that is essential for communication between two people. And it's talking about sort of different phases, anticipating what other people knows. Oh, I think so somehow I got linked to the section of it called Common Ground, which is supposedly a particular kind of technique or something. Anyway, whatever. Point is, this is just as another angle on people sort of investigating stuff like this. Oh yeah, interesting. They have like different examples of like how do people do, how do people get common knowledge and who sort of pays the cost for that? Or like how do people like, you know, there's like paying the cost by having one person formulate something more in more clearly, right? Like or then there's paying the cost by having the listener do more interpretive work. I'm not sure why I brought all that up. Common knowledge stuff is important. The we-ness thing is important. I think, yeah, I think there's a thing here. And I got a lot of this stuff from you. Like my understanding of common knowledge is deeper because of conversations you and I had in like 2015.
I think to a large extent, I thank Critch for.
Right. Yeah. And I think Duncan wrote up an article on the Critch's miasma thing, which I will put a link to.
Was it Critch's? I thought Duncan came up with miasma and wrote that up. And then Critch commented on something related as well.
Oh, anyway. I had the impression that Critch didn't want to bother writing it up, but he sort of encouraged Duncan to.
Okay.
But I could be wrong. Anyway, so yeah, so this common knowledge stuff. So it seems to me like if you have two people looking at each other and they're trying to recursively model each other, in a world where and there's something relevant about the left and right hemispheres here too, I think, in terms of like adversary versus collaborator. Like I've just been reading The Matter with Things, McGilchrist's new book, and I'm still just wading through many more psychiatric cases of people with brain damage before I've gotten to anything that sort of would not have belonged in The Master and His Emissary. There's a ton new case studies. I think you'd find it quite useful. Like you get like way more sort of variations on Mother's Arm and stuff, and along different sensory dimensions, time and stuff, which is leading to whatever points he's going to get to later. Anyway, so I was reading through that and lost my train. Matter of Things. And so he was talking about how the left and right hemisphere both model other agents, but in different ways. Like the left hemisphere tends to be more adversarial. It's like, oh, like I need to, you know, like I'm a cat, I want to eat that mouse. Like, what's it gonna do, right? And you know, likewise, if you were like, you know, probably if you are, let's say a walrus, and you're facing off against another walrus, and you're trying to like suss out whose tusks are bigger. And there's this whole thing where animals prefer, like the thing about virtual bargaining is relevant here too, because, you know, it's very costly to actually have that fight. So usually there's a bunch of posturing and stuff, right? Until one side backs down and it's the side that probably was going to lose. And then in rare cases, it actually comes to blows, which sucks for both, but is sort of necessary for the thing to actually be grounded out in reality. So, with all of that as just kind of background context, I'm sort of loosely imagining, you know, like you're doing this, like, what is it like to be this other person? And like, there's sort of two contexts that you might be doing this in, okay? And there's many, but like I'm going to just highlight two. Context number one, you're looking across at this person, you're like, what's it like to be them right now? And between the two of you is a chessboard, right? There's like a way that you're trying to imagine their thinking, which in this particular case is quite constrained to solving this chess puzzle. Although you maybe are also trying to suss out their psychology a little bit. Are they tired? What kind of lapses are they likely to make today? People usually don't play chess like this, as I understand it. They're usually just like play the board, not the other player.
Bobby Fischer.
But there may. Pardon?
Bobby Fischer was famous for tracking exactly that sort of thing and using psychological tactics on his opponents in order to win chess matches.
Yeah, I used to do that a bit with a friend of mine who was way better at me than chess. And so one of the ways that I could beat him was by making ambiguous moves that would put the board in unusual situations for him. And especially if I could make them in such a way that he thought that I had a secret plan, he would then start spinning up a bunch of gears trying to figure out what my plan was. And I actually had just done a weird thing that seemed like not an obviously bad idea, but I'd done it in a way that was like, huh, right? And so like, like fucking with his model. And he would have done much better to just keep playing the board and completely trounce me by understanding what the fuck the board is doing better, which I was failing at. Anyway, so, but like, there are other games where like knowing the other person's psychology is much more important for various reasons. Poker, let's say, actually, that's maybe an even much better example. That's actually, yeah, way better than chess, because with poker you actually have hidden information. So you're looking at the other person, you're like, okay, they know which two cards that they've got in their whatever, and they're seeing this, they're seeing me and the bluffs I've made. And it's like modeling them but adversarially. A different like looking over and like being like, what's it like to be that person, is like you're in bed with your lover and you're like looking across at them and you're like, wow, what is it like to be you with me here in this moment? Like and it seems to me that in the poker case, there's a kind of guardedness where you actually want to interfere with the other person being able to model you, basically.
Right.
Whereas in the lover case, ideally, you actually sort of want to invite the other person in. You want to create a we of some kind. And I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody. Some people in some situations, such as me, if I'm with my partner, like want to create a sense
Right.
of that kind of connection together. And a team that's working on a shared project also wants to create some amount of being able to do that. And maybe this ends up being kind of like common knowledge, but the common knowledge thing gets blocked in the adversarial case.
This is the poker example is, I know this wasn't your main point. There's
No.
The thing that this is evoking for me. Like there's a piece of how to do H3 flavored culture that landed really clearly for me, in large part because of Perry Chase, some of my interpretations of Perry's stuff. Yeah. And I wrote this up in the signaling isn't about signaling, it's about good heart.
I'll also put a link to that.
Which, like, I wasn't trying to make a good article. I was just trying to splat out a kind of general theme, because it was driving me nuts seeing the way that people were talking about certain kinds of patterns. And I wanted to try to articulate this thing. But like in one way of expressing that, it is navigating coordination by being transparent and seeking to be the entity that the people I want to coordinate with would want to coordinate with, within the parameters of what I actually desire. Like not yes. violating myself. That would be fawning stuff that doesn't actually work and would violate the strategy anyway.
And would technically not be the thing you described, but could look like it. So yes, good clarification.
Right. But I just noticed that the way that I intuitively run that would actually bar getting good at poker, even as a game. And I don't think that's inherent. I just didn't notice that before.
Oh, yeah.
Like the whole thing about, yeah, go ahead.
I was earlier this week playing a social deception game that was like, it's sort of like Werewolf or Mafia, except somebody tried to like fix all of the things that are shitty about those, like getting eliminated early on and just being like, well, I guess I'll twiddle my thumbs for an hour. And so it also made it a lot more complicated in the process, but and it's called Blood on the Clock Tower. It seems good. Check it out if you're interested. That's mostly to other people, but maybe you are also interested. Point is, we were playing this game, and I was thinking, as I often do when I play social deception games these days, I was thinking about the relevance of this to building kind of collaborative superorganisms. And in this particular instance, I found myself wondering what uh, what it would be like to have a bunch of people um, who suppose that you had 20 people who were like totally doing the Gen 3 thing together effectively, like and knew it, and had experienced that a bunch with each other. And then those 20 people, or some subset of them, because 20 is a lot, go and like play a game of werewolf, or one of these other social deception games. I'm like, what would that be like? I could imagine, I don't know, I genuinely do not know if this is true, but I could imagine that the group, that it might be almost impossible for evil to win. And I think like, because people would be so attuned to what common knowledge clicks feel like, and or something, and how they're like hard to create out of like fabricated layers.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff where like my favorite version of this has been One Night Ultimate Werewolf.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, I've played tons of that.
Yeah, it's like 10 minutes max.
Yeah.
Like,
so good.
done.
So good.
Yeah, and you can do lots and lots of rounds. So my family calls that game Michael Always Lies. So like, there's the default thing that'll happen in a lot of games like that is that people will start to argue points that, as soon as the argument starts, what the exchange has to be. And a lot of the reason that, like, I end up trouncing my family in this game pretty consistently, regardless of which side I go on. But a lot of that is because I see, as soon as a conversation starts, of, well, I'm not the werewolf, is like, well, as soon as you say that, it's like, well, that is zero information.
Yeah.
And then you just watch the conversation go, and it's like you're wasting time on zero information. And so I think I would think that one of the things that such a collective would be really good at is not wasting time on the zero information moves.
Right. It would, like, everybody would, especially as they got familiar with the game, but even before that, certain like claims and stuff become pretty obvious. As they got familiar with the game, it would yeah, it's like, you start to see the gradient of like that utterance just like doesn't help the good team. There's no world in which that utterance helps the good team, or something like that. And there might be an asymmetry between those. Yeah.
I think it's much more complicated than that, because I'm thinking of things like, if I lie about being the seer or whoever it is,
Yeah.
So I lie about having a role, but it's because
hang on a sec. Let me just mentally boot up my One Night Ultimate Werewolf scene, so I'm like slightly more in sync with you, because the version we're playing last night is like longer and actually has the interesting property of you can go off in little groups of 2s and 3s and chat, which is really neat, right? And then you get to use the evidence that 2 people went off and talked as like, well, we just found that guy did something sus, and he was talking a lot with this guy, like, anyway, super interesting. But I want to just like, I've played tons and tons of One Night Ultimate Werewolf, so I just want to like briefly like recenter my thinking in that, so you and I are more in sync with the examples we're talking about. Everyone, open your eyes.
Well played. Yeah, so there are subtleties there along the lines of, and I think this is true of most of these deception games, and a lot of conversation in these deception games amount to people noting facts like this. So if I think I'm a villager, and one of the interesting things with One-Night Ultimate Werewolf is
Right,
that
is you
you
don't
actually
actually,
don't know what team you're on,
yeah, because
and
it
you're
kind of
trying
been
to
swapped.
figure it out,
Yeah.
right? But even if I'm pretty sure that I'm a villager, like the Insomniac, for instance, can know that what team they're on.
Yeah.
Like that's like
And unless there's
an
weird
attribute
cards,
alert.
the Troublemaker also knows that they're like in the base set, the Troublemaker always knows that they're going to be villager, even if they get robbed and become the robber.
Yeah. Um, so there are places where you can know your team, but anyway, if I'm if I'm a villager, but I'm not the seer, I might claim to be the seer uh, in order to push some information cascades,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that includes knowing that I'm agitating whoever the seer is, if there is one,
Right, right. But
right? Because I'm
that gets you a
implicitly
bunch of information.
signaling,
Yeah.
right? And I'm implicitly signaling something to them which they can't tell. They can't tell what side of the signal it is.
Yeah.
The other side of the signal is I could be a werewolf trying to cover myself, and I might actually do that, saying, "Look, I'm the
Yep.
seer." And so part of the issue is that, especially because there's ambiguity about even knowing what role you're playing, like what team you're vying for
Yeah.
initially, there are no utterances that systematically will come from somebody who knows that they're
Right.
one side versus the other. Because if they were, it would immediately be weaponized as a signal for the other side. So, with the exception of,
Right.
it never makes sense to admit that you're a werewolf. Like that.
Unless you're the Tanner.
That is true. I haven't played much with the Tanner.
Okay. Yeah. But even there, then people are like, but maybe he's the Tanner, though. That's why he's saying he's the werewolf, right? Like everything gets,
Yes.
Right. Recursed on.
Right. What I'm highlighting there is that it seems to me like it's the question of, like, this relates closely to how H3 interfaces with H2. Because like these are flexing some very particular H2 skills in a game-like format.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, I imagine that the structure of, like, would an H3, like, how different would an H3 group playing One-Night Ultimate Werewolf actually look? And the only thing I've got is I think that they would spend much less time arguing back and forth about zero information things, because they would be used to propagating information as a group, and they would already have that as sort of a flexed muscle between them.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I also don't know. It seems like mostly a question.
Yep.
At this phase. A few years ago, just a few months before I got into the non-naive trust dance stuff, I played a game or two of Werewolf, and I found myself thinking, oh, this could be a really powerful game for like training people to sort of recognize where the chaos is coming from in their group. Basically, it's sort of like if you abstract it away from werewolf and villager, and you just say there's team truth and there's team lies. And then you're trying to figure out, like, which whatever. Isn't that may be a worse game?
So you might end up with a kind of, gosh, you might end up with a really curious phenomenon of part of the problem, though, like, thinking specifically of One-Night Ultimate Werewolf, I think that you run into a significant problem of you don't know which team you're on.
Oh yeah, when that is true, you have a different kind of game, just straightforwardly. Yeah. The thinking that I do
about the others.
the thinking that I did about this came out of a version of pretty textbook werewolf, like had a few special roles, but mostly it was just villagers and a few wolves. And there was no changing of teams, and it was multiple rounds, not the one night version. So that was where my thinking came out of this.
Yeah, and in that case, that makes
thought.
a lot of sense.
But I talked to somebody afterwards, and he said that like he and a friend had at one point tried to like play a super distilled version of this, where it was like it was two people and they had three or four tokens or something, and the way the tokens worked were like call it like red and blue or something. And if both of you have blue tokens, the thing that you want to do is like disarm or something. And if one of you has a red token and the other has a blue, then the win condition for red is that blue disarms. Is something like, you know, like sort of some sort of move that's like sort of like a cooperate defect move, or like a you know peace war, something like that, whatever. But it was very yeah, it's like, so if you're red, then your win condition is, so it's like if you're blue, you win or lose together. If you're red, if you're red and the other person's blue, then you win if they lose by thinking that you are blue, basically. And then I forget if they played with a version where there's two red tokens, in which case, so there's a few ways you could do this. Like, one of them is that there's literally, okay, so I mean, so one version of this would be the thing is perfectly symmetrical, no, hang on. I don't know. There's some interesting games here, but the point I wanted to make was actually not like sort of what's the game design space here that's interesting, but the thing was that they had gotten their werewolf game distilled down to the point where it was basically just like going back and forth, looking in each other's eyes and being like, I'm lying, I'm telling the truth. Like there's no extra information, right? Like it's just, and just trying to figure, like, could they tell the difference between somebody who is lying and telling the truth? And they basically, like, after a few hours of playing this game, sort of shit got weird. And I'm not actually sure that like that would be good to do. Like it might something in your brain. The other thing I wanted to say about this was that when I first started thinking about this just before the NNTD, I was still thinking about the idea that the thing to do with agents that seem to be trying to corrupt you is to fight them. And I no longer think that post NNTD. Like the thing to do is not to identify the agents that are trying to like corrupt you and it's like I want to geez, this is weird. It would be cool to design a game like this. So it's a game that is somehow simultaneously cooperative and competitive, but contains a set of sort of rules whereby win-wins can be created that don't sort of previously exist. But in the meantime, there's an incentive to be cagey about what your win conditions are or something like that. So it's sort of like, it's basically like werewolf becomes boring if any werewolf can just give up their werewolfness and join the good team, and then, hey, everybody's on the good team, everybody wins, right? Like this is dumb. But if there were a version where the process by which you get everybody on the same team is actually difficult, but it's possible, which it's not in werewolf, but difficult, then you would have a bit of a puzzle of like, okay, so at the moment we don't trust each other. But like we could, but like, like, and something like that.
And this is sort of like, I think we created this game already, and that is culture.
Yes. Yes, yes. I mean, I'm saying it'd be nice to have a distilled version that you could like,
Yes.
experience many perspectives of in an evening. But yeah, that's the idea. Um, this connects with the thing in the podcast too around like game theory transforms when agents can merge. And in general, a lot of game theory is completely missing the move of, hey, guys, I invented a way where we can both get what we want that didn't exist in our payoff matrix before. Check it out. Oh, yeah, that would totally work. Oh, cool. Well, let's do that then. Yeah, let's do that. Great. Do you guys want to grab pizza afterwards? Like, inventing such a move is just completely missing from game theory as it's classically practiced. And so, like, the idea that game theory transforms when agents can merge, it's like, arguably, in a lot of cases, we actually would like to merge. We just trust ourselves as an individual better to meet our need than we do the collective. And so, insofar as we're caring about stuff and we don't trust the collective to care for that, we're not going to merge. But if we did, we just would. Like, we would just be like, yeah, cool, collective. Let's sort it out, right? And so, like, game theory changes when you get better perspective taking skills and capacities and more like skill at finding an omni-win solution.
Yeah.
I think you could develop an omni-win game, like a game where like every person has a different win condition, and the aim is to like have everybody's win condition satisfied. And then you could maybe make it slightly more interesting where you somehow have it like there's a timer, like, there's a timer, and if the timer goes off before everybody's win condition satisfied, then anybody who had like had a game state that like the most of, like, suppose that there was at one point a board state that had satisfied 3 out of 4 people's things. Yeah. But like, you could have this where it's like the board, there's a board and there's colored tokens on the board, and one person like only wins if there are 4 or fewer tokens, and another person only wins if 3 tokens are in a perfect line, and another person only wins if there's at least 2 blue tokens, right? And then each person takes turn making a move, and like they're like pissing each other off because they're like causing problems for each other, but they're like, there is an omni-win solution. Or maybe another like way that you can win is by like collectively voting, we think there's no omni-win here, right? Like some person needs fewer than 2 tokens, or person needs more than 4, but you're sort of like not allowed to talk about it. You can say very little about it, so you have to like sort of negotiate it all through the through just the kind of like, well, this person seems to like always be taking tokens off. They probably have a token cap. Like,
yeah, it is neat to think about the possible game design there. I am melting, and I need.
We've been talking for like 3 hours at this point, so yeah. This has been fun, and I feel like we've answered some questions. I feel like there's still some deeper stuff to see together, and yeah, I'd be interested in coming back to some of these places where we're seeing things differently, and just like having our primary aim be, in some sense, like iterate on how do people who are seeing things differently do the parallax thing, and then like we use the different things we're sitting with as case studies in that. I think that would be sort of the juiciest thing you and I could get up to at the moment.
Yeah,
which in some sense we are doing.
Unsure if there even is a difference in our views here, but to the extent that there is, and yeah, I would really love to fuse that into parallax.
Well, right. And I mean, there's inevitably some sort of difference, at least in how we're framing it. And so it could be like, when you say, I don't know if there is a difference between our 2 views, it's like, if you showed me a snapshot of what I'm seeing right now and a snapshot of what I'm seeing right now, and I could only look at one of them at a time, I would not be able to tell you like which of them was left and right. Like, they're too close. Like, without being able to jump back and forth between them, I wouldn't be able to to tell, or I'd have to like look very fucking closely. So and yet depth perception. So the fact that we approximately agree is also part of the point. Beautiful. Take care. I will post this, and I'll post a bunch of links below. We'll start collecting stuff into that little library of things.
Sounds good. And send me that article you were mentioning.
Yes, the paper about unwritten rules and virtual bargaining.
Yeah.
It's coming your way right now.
Exciting.
Sweet. All right. Cool. I will talk to you later.
Sounds perfect.